Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org.
Okay.
Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt, and I'm here with one of my good friends, author, Jay, I want to call you a philosopher. And if you know me, that's about the highest compliment I can give you. But Jay Levy is our guest today, author of a couple books. I've got the cross-cultural dialogues on homelessness, which Robin Johnson joined us for a previous episode. We're going to talk a little bit more about the pre-treatment work Jay does, which is in this book as well. But if you want to go back to that podcast, you can just go in and Google Jay Levy or Robin Johnson and get that. I highly encourage you to do so. So Jay, welcome back to the show. I want to just give you what we met, I believe, at a Healthcare for the Homeless conference. And there's
Right.
just people that I meet in my travels, in my talks, that it's like, I need to kind of reel in because I got some stuff to learn from. And quickly thereafter, you introduced me to your work on pre-treatment, and it just filled a gap. It filled a need that I had, because it's so many times I see our intakes, how we begin our relationship with people as, and we don't do it intentionally, but re-traumatizing to folks. Basically, tell me about all the worst moments of your life. And that's the worst way to build imagine dating somebody and saying, tell me about your past psychiatric history, just like the worst way to begin a relationship. So I'm so excited that we have some time really to focus in on the pre-treatment concept. So just for our audience, give us a little bit more of a formal introduction of you and the work that you do.
Okay. Well, first of all, great to be here, Matt. And I've really been excited about your work too in trauma-informed care. I've attended some of your trainings, and I've read some of your books, and so that's been a real treat. In terms of myself, I've been around doing this work over 30 years now. I began out in New York City doing street outreach, and I was going to places like the Port Authority, Penn Station, Central Park, and really getting to know people and their stories. And it was really enlightening, I'd say, to find people on the streets and to really connect into their sense of meaning in terms of what they were doing and how they were living, and really upholding the way they found ways to adapt to very harsh environments that are not easy to survive in. So that was my first kind of attraction and step into the homeless world. From there, I traveled to Boston, settled down on the outskirts in Somerville, but did work in Boston proper, visiting various shelters, and also worked with a vocational program that centered on working with folks who were homeless. Did some private practice out that way as well. And that was great, because I was getting to some different settings and really working with a different social network, in the Boston area. And then I had the privilege of moving to Western Mass, and the homelessness situation there was a little more spread out. There was less shelters, some shelters, but smaller ones. And I was meeting a lot of people who were living in the woods and along the riverside. So I feel like I've had a real opportunity to work with folks in all sorts of different environments. And as a result of that, kind of just through my journey, pre-treatment started to bubble up as kind of a natural approach that I would say it's akin to outreach counseling. So it kind of came out of my efforts of doing outreach and trying to understand the best ways of engaging people and working with folks. And from there, this whole concept of pre-treatment kind of came into being. The other piece is, since you mentioned the idea of philosophy, I'll just mention I was a philosophy major, so you were able to pick up on that as an undergrad. I did philosophy and psychology as kind of a dual major, and then I achieved a master's in social work. And currently, I oversee various outreach teams in the Western Massachusetts area. And so we've been dealing a lot lately with the whole COVID-19 pandemic and just the realities on the ground, which are pretty difficult in regard to that.
Well, at some point I'll have you back and we'll talk existentialism, but I'll hold that for a different time because, like I said, pre-treatment has been, I think about it's kind of fun writing the book Connecting Paradigms. I really tried to give an integrated model of bringing, the main factors were neurobiology, trauma-informed care, and motivational interviewing. Something, that I love what Robin does over in the UK, psychologically informed care. And I think I was kind of working with that model, the way he sort of describes it. And I always think about, because, I'm always reading, I'm learning more. For those listeners, I get obsessed about things and chase them to the nth degree. Pre-treatment is definitely, if I ever write the second addition to the book, pre-treatment will be one of those paradigms, because I think it's it just gives a structure to something we all, I think, in the service provider profession, nobody likes the intakes we do. And I've started to rant against them. I actually went to an HIV national conference a couple years ago and just did a rant. It's like, we got to stop. Like, nobody likes these. The feds don't necessarily make us do it the way we do it. So let's stop re-traumatizing folks. So I would love to get a definition of pre-treatment, and also, you kind of gave us the hint about how you did, how outreach kind of informed that approach, but just kind of how you came to bringing this really practical, useful trauma-informed tool to the world.
Sure. So I guess where I'd start is we're trying to reach the folks through outreach counseling that are not raising their hands and saying, look, come help me. I'm in need of services. I have a mental illness or an addiction, and I'm looking for treatment. So the idea that it's called pre-treatment means that it begins prior. And I came across this notion of the pre-contemplative iceberg. I was talking with Jim Withers, street medicine guru, and he had used that term, this idea of the pre-contemplative iceberg. When I think about it in terms of pre-treatment, it's all about how do we melt that pre-contemplative iceberg. And so it really begins with relationships, getting person-centered. There's a lot of research that's been done, kind of meta research by Wampold back in, I think, 2001 or so, which was looking at different therapeutic models and kind of what was the secret to the success of therapy. And they found that really a lot has to do with the alliance, the therapeutic alliance between the worker and the client. And then there's other kind of general factors like a sense of motivation, problem recognition, some other things. So in pre-treatment, what we try to do is to look at those general factors and then to sort of codify it into, and they literally called this pre-treatment variables, by the way, in the research. So that's how I sort of got the name. And then from there, we try to codify that into particular principles of doing the work with folks. So everything starts with one, building a relationship and thinking in terms of stages of engagement. Because what you're going to find through the pre-treatment model, one of the keys is we always want to get where the person is at. We don't want to be going in with our own agenda, our own, like where we're at, and then trying to get the person to follow us. That doesn't work, especially with the people who are not raising their hands. It's one thing if someone's coming in, they're already motivated, and they're already recognizing a problem, and they're saying, what can I do? And they're looking to you as the expert. On pre-treatment, it's the reverse. We're kind of going out there and we're honoring that everyone we meet is an expert in their own lives. And we need to kind of delve into their expertise. And from there, develop the pathways. So I talked a lot about pre-treatment pathways, the pathways toward healing. But it's got to come from them. And it's got to come from their own recognition of something to be worked on and helped with. And so if they're not raising their hands, you have to start with just kind of the relationship level and kind of the non-clinical level. You know, what's their daily concerns? What's their daily challenges? What are their strengths? What's already working versus not working?
Yeah.
So I'm fond of saying when we do pre-treatment, one of the big sort of central quotes that I use to describe the model is that we're interpreters and we're bridge builders. Those are the two things that we do really, really well. And so in always getting where people are at, it starts with engagement, relationship building. I work with stages of engagement, and I like stage theories for that kind of reason, because it helps you to stay with the person, and it gives you an idea how to do an intervention that's right in line with the stage of the relationship when we're talking about engagement. So are we in pre-engagement at a point where we don't even have yet a welcomed communication? Are we in engagement, like the center of it, where really we're at a point of defining roles, having some regular outreach meetings? We have not yet agreed to do any particular kind of work with the person, but we're getting to know them and we're getting to understand their words, ideas, values, their stories. A lot of this is drawn from narrative psychology. So that's very important. So it does kind of connect into phenomenology and existentialism, because narrative psychology is very much built off of that kind of philosophy. So that's sort of the first part of it. And then from there we go into developing goals, which is the contracting stage of the engagement process. And it's very important that the goals are defined using the words, ideas, and values of the client. So not our clinical language. And the goal could just be, I want to get housed, you know? It doesn't have to be, I want to reduce my anxiety. I mean, it could be that. Of course, the people we meet have quite a trauma background, because homelessness and trauma is so interconnected. So that's on our playing field, you know, dealing with trauma. It's often one of the bridges we use in our language work, which is the next principle, common language development. And we're connecting again into people's words, ideas, values, their world, how they define it, and defining a goal through their words, their terminology. And then from there, bridging language to the different houses of language in the community, which includes resources and services that the person may want to access in time that's in line with their goals. And then we support transitions. So the third principle is ecological considerations and supporting those transitions to services, resources, new environments, housing, as well as talking about just the way they're coping with homelessness and how they've adapted to that and what's working, what's not working there. And that becomes a whole piece of the counseling process with folks. And then change model, and motivational interviewing, we draw off of that. And then work, of course, with the stages of change, which we can talk more about if you'd like, but that's very important. And I try to connect that into kind of 5 different areas when we look at stages of change, whether it's connected to people's having mental health concerns. You know, are they pre-contemplative, contemplative, preparing to access help around that? We're looking at addiction, medical concerns. So that's 3 different sort of domains that we can apply the model to. But we also apply it to housing, and we also apply it to generating income, just where people are at in regard to these different realms as we do the work. And then the last, and this is central to pre-treatment, is really focusing on safety. Whether we do that from a harm reduction perspective or from looking at it from crisis intervention, if people are very acute, maybe a danger to self or others, or in need of an immediate detox from drugs, or there's been an overdose and we're calling emergency services. So it could be that crisis opportunity to connect people very quickly into treatment and healthcare and what they need, or it could be this very sort of slow process of getting to know a person, doing the harm reduction piece, working kind of with getting people need items, but it also touches upon ways that we can begin to talk about other ways of living and being that might be better. So if someone is out in the woods and we're providing them with, let's say, a blanket and a tent and that kind of thing, that's to reduce the harm of living outside. At the same time, we're talking about shelter opportunities, housing opportunities. We're using it as an engagement tool and helping people to envision, a better life maybe that they could have for themselves. So that's kind of the core of pre-treatment, is those 5 principles. And the work is really, how do you bring this all together simultaneously?
Yeah.
So it's not like you're just working on one thing. Really, it's all 5 of these things all at once. And so it's a little different than trauma-informed care, I think, in that while it definitely overlaps a great deal, there's some differences in that we're really starting with people's stories, and we get, it's sort of like the trauma-informed care is almost like the next stage. It becomes part of the treatment in terms of moving folks forward.
Yeah, and how I guess I kind of think about it when I read your books is, to me it becomes it's a trauma informed approach. Kind of like if you think about maybe like EMDR or trauma informed CBT, like I kind of think about it, even though it's a little bit more overarching in some ways. That's kind of like the category I kind of look at it is here's a great tool, because a lot of times the outreach, the case managers, the folks that are not kind of in the master's degree, see you once a week sort of scenarios, don't get a lot of attention as far as best practices and those pieces. And that's what I really loved about your work, is you're giving, I think, a great structure that just, like I said, fits in perfectly to harm reduction, to trauma-informed care, to that's what I love about it. It's just like, hey, this just fits. It's like, you just gave me a language and to use for everything I already value and the way I think about the world and the work. So that's what I love about the work that you've done.
Yeah, I think it really, begins with safety at its core. So obviously that's a big tenet of trauma-informed care. And it brings all of the control over to the client.
Yeah.
So that's also a tenet of trauma-informed care. So just those 2 things alone, respecting a person's autonomy and then getting kind of goal-centered. And I think what we do is in respecting the expertise of the person that we're working with, kind of what also happens as we get person-centered, interestingly enough, is it also unleashes our own expertise, which we can't, I think, go in assuming or just offering. In other words, so what's great about pre-treatment is you can utilize it like as part of street medicine, or it can be part of like a social worker doing street outreach, or it could be a case manager in a shelter, or it could be a therapist beginning work with someone who's not quite at a, very pre-contemplative, let's say, but you're looking to engage more and you want to set the table for the therapy. So we want to get to the point where we're working with a client, and then our work forward becomes a journey that's kind of a co-production. The worker, their expertise, the client's expertise, how it all comes together toward authoring kind of the next chapter in the work that's done. And that's sort of the narrative sense, that we're doing a co-writing and we're moving this forward. It's very transactional,
Yeah. So I'd love to ask this question, because it's something that, like, as I introduce this as part of, again, trying to get the, and I probably take the work, I'll just own it up front and say, oh, there's a problem I have, that people are re-traumatizing folks through their intake.
Yeah.
Pre-treatment's the pill I'm going to give to it. And so I'll own that piece. Is I just got so excited, as this is I can hand people a book and say, this is going to tell you what you're doing wrong and how to do it right, at least from a philosophical perspective. But the question I have, though, so I'll own my piece of this, is, in a lot of our systems, and this is a very kind of a rigid question, but it's one I've been really wanting to ask, is, everything's prescribed, everything, our first contact, the intakes we have to do. And what I loved about pre-treatment, it's kind of like harm reduction when I first learned about it, it challenged me to be uncomfortable for a second. It's like, okay, I need to rethink about this. And the fact it's getting some good outcomes is something I really need to pay attention to. And I need to look at why I'm being challenged by this. And not now, harm reduction probably like is kind of part of my DNA and how I see the world. How have you seen or helped or integrated this in? Because I think what I took from your work is pre-treatment, we have to be careful that we just don't plug it onto the first session and call it pre-treatment. That there's this flexibility where there's not a formal necessarily engagement yet in the system, which gives the worker a lot of flexibility to build the relationship and really implement best practices that we're not going to lead into engagement. So we just kind of wonder from your perspective, as you've talked to people who've tried to implement this, probably around the world now, since I know you've done some work and are thinking with the UK's thinking about this as well. Mm-hmm. How, if I wanted to bring this, but there's no kind of funding for this relational I'm just going to use the word. I don't know if I would use it if I thought about it for more than 2 minutes, but kind of more of an informal relationship building piece before I can say this is a client and now I can bill for this person. I can now enter this person in my system.
Right.
And that's a weakness, I think, of our system, but it's also a reality. And I'm sure you've hit that and just kind of wondered as you've tried to integrate this into systems that might not really have initially the flexibility to say, okay, this is how we're going to fund the staff doing pre-treatment. What has some of the problem solving been around bringing this innovation into systems?
Right. No, it's a great question. And I think there's a few different roads toward considering it. One is what we're doing in terms of the intake process when it involves a pre-treatment approach is it's very much integrated with engagement. So it's an intake that happens over time rather than like in a 1 hour meeting. And that intake could take a couple weeks, it could take a couple months. It really depends on the client and their pace. And that intake will also look different. So what'll happen is, as you're engaging with a client and you're developing what I call the playground of language, acceptable terms that the client can hear and will respond to, and they're in charge of that playground, by the way. They decide what terms are allowed and what's not allowed, right? So if I start asking questions about their psychiatric history and they're not comfortable with that, they're allowed, of course, to say that. And I need to be sensitive enough to not continue down that lane because I have some form that I'm filling out that says I'm supposed to continue to ask these types of questions. So literally what pre-treatment does on one level is it changes the intake process, maybe even changes the intake form. So I think one of the things is to have a form, that intake that guides people that is much more strengths-based, much more interested in culture, much more interested in what that person values, much more interested in how that person's adapted to whatever kind of situation they're in. Because these are much more interested in how people deal with the daily challenges of just being safe in the world. Much more interested in their network of connections. So this connects very well also with open dialogue, which is a lot about how we kind of work off of people's natural connections and supports, and also in a non-hierarchical way, just have conversations and dialogue, as opposed to saying, no, I have to answer these specific questions. So I think there is a way, number one, to redesign the intake, where it's not all about deficits, psychiatric history, that whole language base that's more treatment oriented, and maybe even get away from that word treatment, because that's a very cold word. A lot of our clients, frankly, don't like the word. It's like, you're giving me the treatment. It's like, it just doesn't sound very friendly and warm. So that's one aspect of it. Another part of this, I think, and it's very interesting to me, and that is looking at pre-treatment on like a meta level of how we apply it. So just like trauma-informed care, you could talk about it on a client level. You could talk about it on a systems level. You can do the same thing with pre-treatment. And when I say we're interpreters and bridge builders, well, that goes for this very question you're talking about. So we need to actually engage the people that are giving the funds, that are designing the intake forms, that are talking about data input, what's required, what kind of data is useful to collect. And to redefine that, it's sort of, in other words, it's coming up with a new common language around these processes. But you got to get those people somehow around the table and for them to see the efficacy of doing this, that this is very important because it's going to more truly reflect what if the programs are doing good work already, then they're kind of missing out on all this good work.
Yeah.
If they're not doing the work, we want to expand the programs to be able to do that work. And so in my own setting, what we do, which I think is effective, is we're able to open clients, and then at a certain point, we're able to admit or enroll clients. So opening versus enroll is two different things. So when we first open a client, that's more of like a soft contact engagement phase, some different work we're doing to set the table, again, to kind of unleash the expertise of the client and the worker together towards starting that journey into recovery, treatment, what have you. So until we get to that, once we get to that, which is really through the engagement phase that I talk about, we get to that point of contracting where we agree to a central goal that, again, that's co-produced, it's acceptable to us as the worker and the way the grant and things define our work. It's acceptable to the client because it reflects directly on their needs and language of what they want to resolve as an issue or work toward as an aspiration or a goal. That's the point where the client then becomes enrolled in the system. So it's going from, it's kind of having a different measure for open versus enrollment, and sort of a recognition that the work might be a little bit different once the person's enrolled. Although you're still going to bring to bear a lot of the pre-treatment stuff just ongoing anyways. Yeah, because it really covers treatment.
Did you have to work with your system to bring that in, or was that something already existing? I just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Well, I've been fortunate because I've been doing this work over 30 years, and I've been in my current position, the organization I work with, since 1992. So what is that?
You got some cred.
Yeah. So, and I've moved up, the ladder as I've stayed there, and so I'm in a position where I'm part of the implementation of like the new data system and things like that. So so I was able pretty easily to bring people around the table, kind of have these kinds of discussions, have things designed in a way that makes sense for the work that we're doing. It's still not, we're still part of an overall nonprofit that does all sorts of clinical work with all different populations and all different kinds of settings, including traditional therapy, psychiatry, what have you. So it's not like it's totally flexible. In other words, there's still challenges there that I even come across in the work that we do. We haven't totally redefined our assessments the way I'd like to see it redefined. But in terms of my supervision with staff, or what I call co-vision, because really, again, it's the same idea of pre-treatment with the clients. It's the same thing of what we do with staff. We have to tune into what's their strengths, what do they find meaningful, what do they value, what can they bring that's going to be productive in the work. It's understanding their culture, their words, their ideas, their values, how that relates to the work they're doing, and giving them a chance to tell their story integrated with the work that they're doing and the people that they're meeting, and kind of an examination of what's working and not working, but within their relationship with the person, right? So it's not my sense of culture being, you should be doing this versus that, but it's really understanding where they are and who they are and how they connect with the client, and maybe how that can be done in a way that's a better fit, for the client in terms of really being where the client's at, and then making offerings to see what resonates and what doesn't in the client's work.
Excellent. And one of the things I found is I brought this discussion, and I'll just, I think they'll be okay because I absolutely love this system. It's the Ryan White Part B folks, the statewide folks in Iowa, and
Oh,
I love them because they take what they learn and they kind of ask the questions. Can we do this any better? And I think they're a great example is that they found flexibility to consider and I'm not sure if they're using the language of pre-treatment. I think they were just mad at me. And right now they're saying, Matt came in and told us our intakes were crap. I'm like, no, you went to one of my trainings and I introduced you to pre-treatment and you had this
yeah.
reaction. And so they're bringing me in as they're doing a 3-day retreat to totally redo their electronic medical records. But they're just one of these folks that, are always looking for that innovation. But I find, as I'm sure you've seen too, the further you move up certain systems, the more rigid they can get.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times, there's more flexibility there than we see. The HIV world is just a great example. And I know this exists in homelessness too, is we're all like, oh, we have to do these assessments by the 3rd meeting. They have to get done. And I'm like, why?
Right.
And
no, exactly. Yeah.
people are looking around. It's like, and I can bring out the universal standards because I love to blame the feds too. Because the further you can blame, especially as a trainer, as long as I don't have to blame you, we can all both blame them. Hey, that's great for everybody. Everybody feels happy. There's the other that's the problem. It's like, no, the feds aren't saying, and so where's the flexibility? Where's the flexibility for the individual worker? And I think to ask those questions, to me, trauma-informed care is, as with pre-treatment, is like, can we do this any better now that we have this understanding? And for me, pre-treatment is one of those answers is, can we do our intakes in a more trauma-informed way? And the fact what I love about your work is here's this structure to help us do that. And I think that's been the big, gift that I've seen you give the world is, there's a better way to do this. And here's a real good structure to do it. So I just think that's amazing.
Thank you. I mean, there's certain institutional biases.
Yeah.
And what happens is when that's sort of there, people don't see it because that's sort of the culture they're operating in. And you get to a point where you don't remember like why you do something the way you do it. So it's some, reflection maybe of a rule from up above from a long time ago that came down from
we've always done it. Yes.
State but it's really worth questioning that kind of thing. And I think at the heart of pre-treatment, and this really connects with that last book I did, Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness, it's so much about crossing cultural divides. So if we start to think about it, in that kind of way, like there's, we know on the ground kind of what works. Yeah. We know what the research says. We know kind of how systems behave and respond and do based on funding and other concerns like that. And I think there's often these cultural divides, literally, between, let's say, the practitioner and the system they're working in, the data people and the on-hands, therapist that's doing the work, or counselor or what have you. And the question is, how do we get a good conversation going about this stuff that's not too threatening? So it's got to be safe. It's got to be trauma-informed in a sense. But allows for us to develop a language where we're really communicating with one another. So it's more of an open dialogue. And the idea is to make it non-hierarchical. So people can feel free to share their expertise and to kind of come together. Let's try to problem solve this together. And just like our work with clients, to get to a point of co-production. And if we can do all that, then we're going to come out with new ways of doing things that are much more effective, that are going to work on all different levels. And I think pre-treatment in a way opens up that door too, in terms of the systems work. And we're in this world right now when I mentioned systemic bias and all that, with kind of the racial tensions and all of that. So again, it's a lot of this is about how do we get people of differing opinions, ideas, values to the table in a language where we can really begin to communicate about this stuff. So it's a challenge for sure. I mean, I'm not going to say it's easy, but I think the work is there around how do you engage, how do you build trust, I think in terms of stages of language development. So it goes from understanding people's words, ideas, values, stories, to utilizing some of the same language, getting to an agreement of what's allowable on that playground of language as we have these discussions, so people are not too easily triggered and sort of turn off or go to a place where their amygdala is like hyperactive, and and then we're just fighting, right? We're fighting, or we're literally in flight, closing down.
Yep.
And that's not the reactions we want. We want to have a productive dialogue. So it all sort of circles back to trauma-informed work.
Absolutely. Well, and here, I didn't know how I was going to transition to the question that I wanted to ask from tying this in is, but you gave me the perfect setup, because we can also think about this from a system level. I've been thinking a lot about, maybe it's the populations I've worked with in my career, homelessness, public health issues, medical adherence, addiction, those sort of that all overcross in my work. But that pre-contemplation to contemplation to preparation, because a lot of our systems, and I think, again, pre-treatment gives me a great language and a structure to say, breathe a second before you challenge somebody to go to action. MI says that creates the resistance. I love that in the last MI book, they found that resistance isn't about the person we're trying to help.
Right.
It's because when we jump ahead of the stages of change from where they're at, to me, that they could have just stopped at that sentence and said, okay, here's the third edition. Just digest that for the next 10 years. But to me, in the word contemplation, I've stepped back and really think about it, because sometimes when it's part of a pie and a model, we're just doing contemplation to get the preparation. But that's a really deep, from the philosophical perspective, from the spiritual perspective, there's a deep reflection about that. And I think with the outreach workers that I've having not done that work directly myself, but talking to a lot of them over the years, they're meeting people out in the community that haven't walked through the door yet, that haven't sort of said, hey, I need this. And we're trying to engage them at this level. So, as we think about that process of helping somebody consider, think about, often maybe for the first time, a big life change from living out in the woods to going into a housing program or even a shelter program to thinking about substance abuse treatment. I just love to get your thoughts on pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and how pre-treatment, you've talked about this a little bit already, really focuses on that initial part of that change journey.
Yeah. So, everything begins again with getting person-centered, being welcomed into the person's world, having that sense of trust, the person knowing that we respect their autonomy, the person knowing that we respect their expertise, having that sensitivity around the language development, where, again, we're working with the playground of language that we've jointly constructed, but the person that we're working with has final say on what's allowed on that playground. And then we're always trying, because we know, through the research, it helps if people have a sense of recognition of the issues they want to work on to help move them forward, even, through the stages of change, let's say. But to get there can be a process. And so what that means in the beginning is we're trying to connect to the person's values, aspirations, goals. So in other words, instead of beginning with what's your problem, you look like you have a mental health concern, look at my assessment, you meet all the criteria for this symptom complex, and this is your diagnosis. That kind of medical model of diagnosis and then treat. So we're kind of rejecting that. We're not saying that it's not good at a certain point in the work, but in terms of pre-treatment, we're not starting there. We're starting with the person's goals, aspirations, and really connecting with their meaning. So I think a very important idea to pre-treatment is the people that we're working with are already adapting, already finding a sense of meaning in their world and surviving in one way or another. So I think it was Viktor Frankl that said, despair is suffering without meaning. And so when we're doing outreach and connecting with folks, we sometimes do meet someone in great despair. But most of the time, I'm actually surprised by the kind of colorful, lively world that they've created in these really harsh conditions that they're living in, and all the trauma they've been through. So people are more than their traumas. They might, in part, they're how they've responded to their traumas. That certainly colors who they are. Their ways that they adapt, their different strengths, their culture, their stories. So the more we respect that going in and the more we learn about that, that sets the whole table to start to have this reflective conversation that you're talking about, this contemplative place where we can begin to melt that pre-contemplative iceberg. But the way we're doing it is we're getting at it through goals. So we know, again, problem recognition is important, but if people don't have that, you start with the goal and the aspiration, and then through working toward that, which is like a psychosocial rehabilitative model of some of the work we've done. There's been a lot of research to show that that's also quite effective with certain folks. That helps to define the problem or give the problem recognition in the sense of the barriers to the person meeting their aspirations and their goals. So from there, you're starting by using the goal, by using the person's values, by using their aspiration. Not only are you building motivation for change, but you're actually using it in change model language to begin to point out discrepancies between the person's world and how their action might be in conflict with their goal, their aspirations, their value. That becomes the ground, if you're speaking a common language, to have what I would call a successful kind of art of confrontation with the person, but it's not you confronting the person, it's the person being empowered to contemplate and confront themselves. And that's the beauty of the work. If you do that, you know you're doing really great work. And that's just great counseling, by the way. That's not just, for the people on the streets or in shelters, or that's just good counseling. That's motivational interviewing. But it's coming from a place, the way the table is set. I think pre-treatment sets it up in a little bit of a different way than maybe you would get strictly from reading a motivational interviewing book. So that's I think where it kind of connects in. But this idea of pointing out discrepancy and really working with people's narratives, their stories, their values, all of that, that is where the power comes into this model and the work.
Well, that's one of the things that, because a lot of times I'm working and training folks who I challenge them to see themselves as advocates, but they often are not the ones making the policies. And I always say, hey, if you hit a wall, who's on the other side of that wall? And don't, just because you hit a wall, stop talking. But one of the things I challenge them to do, because while they sometimes don't have the power, at least initially, to take questions off intakes they don't like, that values question is so powerful. It's like we ask all this other crap about the hell they've been through, their worst days of their life, all of this, and we forget to ask, what do you value most in life? What matters? What are the rules you live your life by? I think those questions set us up and them up for really to have those, in the MI world, those discrepancies, as you talk about, create the cognitive dissonance where I'm either start to be uncomfortable with my status quo or an unrealized future potential. But if all we do is talk about problems, we almost dig ourselves a hole that then we have to dig out of and build a relationship in spite of the horrible way we started it, and then do have those conversations. So that's what I love about the playground model and really having those value-based conversations from whatever values they give you. We're not superimposing ours on them. And that's where change really happens. And that contemplation when we bring the values in, now we're getting the deeper level of that word. It's not just, hey, we have a housing program. Are you interested in learning more about it? Right? It's finding that deeper connection to what they aspire to in life, what
Well,
they want.
and it's really approaching the people we meet with a real sense of appreciation and awe for their situation and who they are and their story. And the
Yeah.
more we do, I got this from Suzanne Quinney, who did some work on the last book that I did.
Mm-hmm.
I co-edited with Robin Johnson and myself. I wrote about half the book, but the other half of the book had guests that came in and wrote different chapters from the UK. And Suzanne talks about appreciative inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So I like this notion of appreciative. I mean, just think of the phrase appreciative inquiry, that you're really starting from this place of appreciation and awe and kind of exploring where the person's at, what they're doing, what's already working.
Yeah.
So we're not starting with the problem. And with that, we come up with all sorts of ideas, but I think you have to help the worker be comfortable with going on these journeys where they don't have set answers in front of them, where they don't have the formula ready on what to do to work and where to go, that they're really willing to let go of that sense of control, hand it over to the person and believe in the relationship and the power of that relationship and the language that can come out of it that's going to begin to give us all sorts of new ideas, places we would never go. So I think what happens is when people are too treatment oriented and they're too bought into the treatment language, it's like they're only seeing maybe a quarter or maybe half of the picture when they're working with the client. And they're missing this whole other half of, like you said, the values, the culture, the things they're doing that's already working. And with missing that half, you're also then really closing down all these pathways to healing that are there and ready to be tapped if we just connect into people's meaning and current day functioning. So I think that's a real key aspect of this work. I mean, I like how these pre-treatment pathways, as you build a relationship, they seem to just materialize.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you come up with stuff that you would have never thought of first going in, following some kind of intake form or something on how to do the work. So we do a lot of alternative work that you could label as treatment. I mean, it's still basic things like tapping into people's meaning, providing good, meaningful structure, helping the people to expand their relationships and supports in their lives. You know, some real basic things that we know works in the real world toward helping people. And then if you can layer in the expertise as the person is ready to perhaps be diagnosed, to consider a medication, to do some formal counseling, you know, all the better if that can work for the person. You know, it's the same thing when we offer a group, like we have our standard program response. Oh, you have an addiction. Have you done AA? Well, you know, that's fine. I mean, it's fine to make that offering, but the people we're working on the streets, most of them have heard that, you know, thousands of times. And they also know it's an automatic response that they get. So it almost means you're not really seeing me if that's all you have to offer. So that program response is so restricted, and it's not at all respecting the language of the person, their sense of meaning, their values. It can, I mean, once in a while you get lucky at someone that really wants to do that, and it works for that group, that subgroup. But there's all sorts of other ways to introduce structure, meaning, relationships that can have a healing effect.
Well, and I think, you know, you just summed up the complexity of the work in such a beautiful way. It's like, you know, I don't think we give, you know, really anybody in the helping and healing professions the credit that they deserve, you know, because everybody, you're meeting them in such a unique place. If you want to really break it down biologically, their experiences in life, their genetics, their epigenetics have created this unique neurobiological system that's operating, you know, and we've got to figure out, but we've got to, like you said, where are they at, and really craft our communication, be flexible enough to really meet them, and then trying to find that unique journey. Well, what are their values? Because it's going to be different
Right.
than the
Right.
person you just talked to. There's no assembly line sort of methodology
Right.
to this. I think people that set policies sometimes wish there were, because then, if you could define it on paper, then it's just a matter of getting the right amount of funding and hiring the right staff to do it. But it's, that complexity of the work, I think, is
Right.
so underappreciated. One of the things I got to ask you before I let you go, because it's something that I've really talking about this complexity, is the stages of change. Honestly, I learned it in probably undergrad somewhere. It's like one of those things that's just been around.
Yeah.
It's just there. And sometimes when something's there so often, you don't think about it in a deep way. And when I was starting to really write the Connecting Paradigms book, it just became front and center. And that makes sense because it's so central to motivational interviewing. And thinking about that pre-contemplation to contemplation to preparation. But the other piece of complexity that I don't think we speak enough about is when, and let's say we're meeting the person for the third or fourth time. So we know them, we're doing good pre-treatment, so that playground, we're building the relationship, and we're starting to think about pre-contemplation, contemplation. But one of the things I don't think we talk enough about is that person who's experiencing homelessness probably is facing 6 major life changes. If we were to say they need to stop using, they need to get housed, they need to, get in the child welfare system, get their kids, we could just make a list of maybe 6 major life changes. And all those, if you want to call those goals, probably have 20 objectives under each of them. It's one of the things I've really thought about. I love just to get your kind of off the cuff thought about this, is taking a little bit of that psychological or psychoeducational time to talk to people about the stages of change. I had a chance to do this with some client groups when people have me come out to train. Sometimes they got the insight to say, hey, let's have this expert talk to people in services. And I just find they gain a lot of insight. But where I think we can gain some efficiency and really align with harm reduction, meeting them where they're at, pre-treatment, trauma-informed care, is, last time we talked about getting to housing, you're about ready. You identified you were about ready in preparation. I'm wondering where you're at today. And I just kind of wondered, like, it's a question I've been asking some folks I really respect, is one, it just seems like it saves us time because, hey, I want to know where you're at. So instead of trying to dance around the question and we may be talking about 6 changes in a half hour. So it just also seems like an efficiency. So I kind of wonder how you approach that, either training or in your work, of how do you identify where they're at today? Because we all know anybody that's trying to eat healthier, you might wake up in action, and by the time dinner's over and somebody brings out a good dessert, you're back in contemplation. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, as you're pointing out, when you think in terms of these stage theories, whatever it is, whether it's change model, whether it's the engagement process, or it's the common language process in terms of the pre-treatment model, it's very dynamic, right? It's always changing and people can be in different places. And then you're saying, are they in action in regard to, or preparation in regard to what, right? Because there's so many different things going on.
No person is in preparation stage.
Right. So it's kind of, it can be, overwhelming, number one. Number two, I think that it's really about, as the person, you're getting a beat on kind of what's a priority for them in that moment. And I think we have to be very flexible to kind of work with whatever the most pressing priority or priorities are. And I think if we think too rigidly about what we defined maybe in our service planning, let's say we came up with 3 goals and we're measuring where we're at in regard to these problems that we're working on, and connecting it with change model. And we're saying they're at this stage or that stage. The person's coming in and really where they're at is talking about a 4th thing. It doesn't even relate to the 3 goals. We need to be adept at going into that in that moment, because a lot of it is the person needs to feel heard. They need to feel safe. If something else is a priority, it's probably impacting them on this very basic level around safety, survival, crisis, other things. So what I like about pre-treatment is it really says we're always looking kind of safety at the forefront of the model and always being where the person's at. And so change model can actually limit that in the sense of if we've ingrained it too much into our service plan and we think that's the only thing we're working on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's really about tapping in the moment. We're always trying to be in tune with what the client is bringing to the table. They're the expert. So they're going to tell us, how are you today? We could review, this is what we talked about last week, this is where we are. But I'm wondering, as you enter the office today, is that what you want to work on, or are there other things on your mind? And I think if you allow that opening, people will take it, and it'll give you a chance to tune in, as opposed to you thinking, okay, I got my service plan, I'm on solid ground, I know what to do next, I remember they're at this stage, and now I'm going to work on that. And that week that transpired, they could be in a completely different place, different stage, or even on a whole different issue that they want to work on.
Absolutely.
So it's the outreach counselor has to be very adept in this kind of dynamic process of understanding where things are and that change is happening all around us all the time with the groups that we serve.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky because that's the MI research that if we're oftentimes, again, by our paperwork and structure, forced into preparation, and I'm guilty of this. Anybody hearing, I have helped make standards of care where you've got goals and objectives by the time the intake is over, right? And I did that with all great intentions. Like, I don't think any of these things that we now need to relook, any of us did in any malice, so to speak. We were trying to make sense out of a very ambiguous sometimes process. So, but I love the idea and MI gives us about like this shared agenda setting. And it's like, shared agenda, it gives kind of permission to say, hey, what do you want to accomplish in our work together? And just, where we don't have to say, hey, we want to get you housed by next Thursday. Like, and some people might be ready for that, but, getting that general direction. And then one of the other things, and again, I love to make these things let's just make them part of the structure of our conversations is what would you like to achieve today? And I always encourage, especially in the counseling case manager, I have a few things I'd like to talk about, but what do you want to accomplish with our time today?
Right.
So the goal. I'm going to start with even if you want to get your cat neutered and I don't have that expertise, I want to show you, this is your playground. So what do you want to bring on to the playground today? And there's a few things I'd like to talk about as well. And again, there's these little things that over the years I've just appreciated. We can really set ourselves up for a lot of success.
No, I agree. And I think this idea of welcoming further exploration and other ideas onto the table that maybe are not pre-programmed. Anything that gets pre-programmed into the meeting is generally a mistake. In other words, you can have your time to get to some of that stuff with the client's permission, and they'll normally allow it if you've built that pre-programming together anyways, which is hopefully what you've done, then they're going to allow some space for that. But what they're coming in with, what's most pressing, that needs to be welcomed first and foremost. And then if you find out that they keep coming in with something that's different from what you've had pre-programmed, then you better question that pre-programming, right? Maybe we need to alter what we're working on. And the standard, treatment kind of trainings that people do, like someone has an issue with mental health, mental illness, they have an issue with addiction. Well, they say the best way to work is simultaneously on both. Well, that's true. However, you have to start with, where the person is ready to begin. Absolutely. And they might only be ready to begin on one thing and not the other. And even within an addiction or a mental health concern, like mental health, they may be willing to work on their anxiety, but not on perhaps their deep sense of loss. That's something that happened, maybe someone who passed away. Maybe they're just not ready to deal with that part of the picture. or if
Absolutely.
they have if they have some paranoid kind of thinking or something delusional, they may not be willing. They don't even see that necessarily as an issue coming in, although they might see safety and anxiety around the stuff that they're having paranoid ideation about as acceptable to work on. So then we can work on that piece of it. So the same thing holds with addiction, right? Someone might not want to work on their opioid issue, but they're willing to address their alcoholism or vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
And so that's happening all around. And then to get into, can we work on both mental health and addiction together, and homelessness, if we look at that as a third kind of piece to be worked on, it's really tough. But I think they all do interconnect. So what's interesting to me is I'm working on someone around getting housed, which is often an aspiration that someone has, a goal that they're really concrete, and they're really focused on that, along with maybe their day-to-day survival. So those become our focus. As we hit the barriers that's getting in the way, it naturally starts to link into, it could be a medical issue, it could be an addiction issue, it could be a mental health concern, it could be their ability to get along with others, to feel safe around other people, which then might link eventually into talking about a certain level of anxiety or something else, some dynamics in their life around loss, or the way people have mistreated them, or trauma, triggers, all
Yeah.
of that. And so then it starts to, you can start to go a little bit into like Judith Herman's work, and the first stage of trauma work being, let's focus on safety. And
Yeah.
then that can resonate with the person. That's on their playground of language maybe already from prior work. And then you can really start to talk about how can you manage things like triggers and the types of thoughts and processes that come out of that, the anger, the amygdala kind of overload, and all of that. So you can start to get into the brain work and counseling and other things, but it's a real process to get there. So I think pre-treatment really sets the table, and really starting with very basic goals that the client is bringing to the table.
I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up, my friend. I'm tempted to go for another 2 hours, but want to respect your time. We will put show notes with links to the book, other things about Jay's information at traumainformedlens.org. Jay, just give everybody, in case they're just listening, the title of both books, so I don't screw them up. Just so people that might not go just get it in their head.
Okay, I actually have the books with me. So
Awesome.
this pre-treatment guide for homeless outreach and housing first. And we didn't get to talk about housing first today, but this book really goes into that, as well as providing nice stories and overviews of the work of outreach counseling and how to connect with people and apply a pre-treatment model. And then there's cross-cultural dialogues on homelessness. This was co-edited with Robin Johnson, and really reflects a lot on the work that's being done in the UK and the way we've integrated certain models, what they call psychologically informed environments, and how that connects in nice with trauma-informed care and pre-treatment. And some really integrated models that came out of that, including in London, there's a particular clinic that's working with folks with trauma that have now really integrated in pre-treatment work.
Mm-hmm.
And they're actively using that model and researching it, and they're finding that they're having more success in starting and maintaining people kind of within the therapeutic alliance and the ongoing work. So anyways, those are the two books, and there's other books that I've written, but you can go to my website, which is jslevy.com. JAYSLEVY.com, and I'll tell you about the different books. It'll also have a number of these interviews that I've done over time with different folks. Has a number of kind of blog writings on different topics that people can connect into, so that people might find that useful.
Excellent. Again, we'll put that in the show notes too, so everybody can go to traumainformedlens.org to see that. Jay, thank you. I knew I was going to enjoy the heck out of this discussion and did not disappoint. So, my friend, stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you for the gift you've given us. And I just think that your work, if you haven't been exposed to pick up one of Jay's books. It can really help think about this in a different way. So thanks for everything you do, Jay, and thanks for being on the show again.
It's been great to be here, wherever here might be, and hi to everybody, and keep up the good work.